Hey kids, and welcome back to another tutorial video, Rob's Guide to SimCity 4. This is going to be the fourth and final video of this basic guide that I'm making for the game. I may do other videos on specific topics later, things like mods, or, neat features of the network add-on mod and stuff like that. So the idea behind this video is going to be to kind of put everything that we've learned so far together and to focus on how we sort of unleash that to make it work for this game and build cities on a much larger scale. And that's why we're going to be focusing mainly on regional play here. So I think that in order to really take advantage of regional play in SimCity 4, which is one of its more powerful aspects, I think you need to first understand how to make a city function on an individual tile, like here. I think you also need to understand how to, increase the desirability and all that, and make an individual city a better place to live. You also need to understand transportation networks, because as we get into regional play, having a grasp of transportation networks is really important. Otherwise, you're going to end up with huge areas of your city that just don't develop properly because they're not. The transportation isn't planned well enough. So I want to do there's a little side note I want to talk about now, and that has to do with the regional view. I didn't mention it on the first video, but I think it's worth mentioning here. It's a very useful tip that took me a long time to discover. Maybe you guys already know this, but if you press this delete city button here, this will turn into a flat green tile. Okay, you'll lose all the terrain. So let's say you built this, this little city here. Let's say maybe you were building it to make a tutorial to demonstrate. But anyway, let's say you built this city here, and let's put the satellite view on. And you decide that you don't really like how it went. The best way to delete it is actually in the actual city tile, and I'll show you how to do that as soon as the city loads. Right, so we're back in tutorial city here, and we've decided that we don't like this city. We don't like it, and we want to delete it. This is what you do. You go to the God Mode button here. You can see that you don't have all the options in the God Mode button that you did when you were first opening up a tile. You don't have all the terraforming options and stuff. You just have the Reconcile Edges button. You can unleash a disaster, and you can go to, night mode, or day and night mode, or whatever. This button here, Obliterate City, if you click it, it will obliterate the city. Okay, and what obliterating the city does is it deletes all of the mayor mode developments on the tile. It takes a little while. It does this kind of silly, kind of magical animation. I want to point out a couple of things, and I did say this in the very first episode when I talked about the terraforming. I mentioned that any changes you make to the terrain in either God mode or mayor mode, once you've created a city, are permanent on the landscape. So when we hit the obliterate button, it doesn't go back to exactly as it was when you first loaded the region. Any changes to the terrain remain. Okay, so that's just a good thing to keep in mind. You can see here, remember we built that row of trees? Well, it's still there. Okay, so it is a little bit weird. And you may not like that or whatever, but you can now we have access to God mode again, and we can kind of fix it, and maybe we flattened out some terrain and it looks a little bit less natural or whatever. You can go back and fix that afterwards, but that's just a good thing to keep in mind. I mention that because it's very, very frustrating when you put a lot of work into a city and you accidentally hit that delete button and you just deleted the entire the terrain and everything, and it's pretty hard to fix, right? I mean, if we had cities developed all around here and we delete that button and we end up with this flat area, we've lost all of this elevation and everything. It's no fun. You don't want to do that. So I wanted to point that out because it's a really unpleasant mistake to make. It can, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I have done that before, and I have basically just ditched an entire region because of one tile. I fucked up one tile, and it was enough for me to be like, I can't even, and so that's a good tip. Use the obliterate city button, not the delete button. And keep in mind that if we had flattened a bunch of terrain here or something, that it would still be flattened for the next time we use the tile. Right, let's go back to regional mode and start talking about regional city planning. Okay, so we're back in the city view, and I've loaded up a fresh region. This region is called Digby. I downloaded it off the STEX, the SimTropolis file exchange for cities. I will post a link to the user who made this region, and I've loaded this region because it's a very simple region that has a lot of the. You can get some more complex terrain in other regions and stuff, but it's a region that has a lot of different features, different types of city tiles and stuff like that, and so there'll be lots of room to play around in here and explore regional city planning. So we've got this kind of big gulf here and these larger rivers. This would be sort of like the ocean. We've got these little streams or small rivers that kind of go through here. We've got some mountainous terrain. We've got an island. This could be an island city. The island has a mountain on it. So there's lots and lots of stuff going on in this region. And it would be a good region, I think, for a beginning player to download. So I'll put a link to it in the description. However, I want to talk about some basics here. So first of all, let's talk about city tiles. And this has to do with demand caps. We're going to be getting more into demand caps later, but if you work on one city tile for a while and you create a city of a certain size, as I've mentioned a few times, you're going to hit demand caps, and the city won't continue to grow unless you start to play in adjoining regions. So in this city we only have these two little small ones here. Oh god, sorry about that. I clicked found city by mistake there. So we've only got these four. I guess we've got 6 of these little tiny ones, and then a bunch of the mid-sized ones and these large ones, right? So there's large size, medium size, and small size. So the size of a tile is something you want to think about when you're planning your city. If you want to make a very, very big city, you know that you're going to need some large tiles with a lot of space in them for sure. You'll find if you work on a medium-sized tile that it fills up pretty quickly once your city starts to get big. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the nature of Sims commuting and the nature of the different kind of employment areas. And because of the way that neighbor connections work and the way that they relate to demand caps, the edges of cities are very important areas. Okay, and that's just sort of one of the game mechanics. It's in some ways it's a limitation of the game, right? Often you'll get a huge amount of traffic on the neighbor connections because a big dynamic in this game is people who live, say, in this tile going to work in this tile or vice versa. So when you're building your city, you got to keep in mind that the edges of the city are very important, and some important things are going to happen around there. And that's because of neighbor connections, right? So there's a few things to keep in mind. So for example, we know that industrial areas like to be close to the edge because their freight has to leave the tile in order to raise the demand cap, we need freight to leave the city tile, go off the map, right? So when you're looking at a region like this, you might want to think about areas along the edges of city tiles where you can build industrial areas. Now, you can build an industrial area in the center of a tile, say there, but you're going to need to use a port. Or the port is going to be the best way to do that, or you're going to have a very well-planned rail or roads for freight that goes off the map. You'll probably be better off using a port. Now the problem is that ports in the base game are broken, they don't work. They will not increase the demand cap. The freight will leave the map, but the cap will not be relieved, so you won't be able to build any more industrial once the ports have filled up and once you've used up your demand cap. There is a very good mod called BSC Functional Seaports. I will talk about it when I make a video. When I get around to making a video on mods, I'll talk about that one. And it's a very, very complicated mod to install. There are a few workarounds that where you can install a simpler version of it if you don't have the patience to download all sorts of dependencies and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm going to assume that you don't have it for this game. So assuming that you don't have a functional seaport mod, your industrial areas are going to have to be, or mostly going to have to be, near the edges of your city, right? Now let's talk about your commercial areas. Commercial areas benefit from traffic, right? So they benefit from having a lot of traffic going through, and they also, in order to raise commercial office demand caps, you need to have transportation links going off the map. So your commercial hubs are also going to want to be near the edge of the map. And they're going to want to be near an edge of the map where you can link to many different tiles. So if we're looking around this map and we're looking at the tiles and the shape of them, we can see that, say, this tile here has, how many neighbors does it have? Well, it has neighbors on this island. Well, that's a bit tricky because that's a very long crossing, right? So it has a neighbor here, it has a neighbor here, neighbor here, neighbor here, neighbor here, and then it's possible we can do a ferry link or something going here or whatever, right? But this is a little bit of a longer commute. This tile here has a narrower gap here. Of course, you can build a bridge across that, by the way. You can. It's just a very long span, right? This is a bit of a narrower span here, somewhat narrower anyway, still quite a large span for an urban bridge. And then you have connections to this city, this city, this city, this city, this city, and this city. You've also got these 1, 2, 3, 4 tiles that are all quite close, and that would not involve a huge commute time. So a pretty good area for a commercial zone might be in this little pocket corner here, right? Because you could have residential areas feeding into it, and you would have lots and lots of traffic coming in there, right? And then maybe you could put some industrial areas there and on the edges, and then maybe you could also do some industrial zones around the edge of your city here, say, a little bit there and a little bit there and down here, and that would mean that you'd have Sims going out to industrial areas there, and maybe through maybe if you put some industrial areas there and there as well, you could have your Sims going through the commercial zones to the industrial zones and creating more traffic and all of that. So that could be an interesting hub right in the middle. Residential areas, and this, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but residential areas also, it's going to be easier for you if they're built near the edge of a city. So typically if you're building an industrial area on one edge, say you're building an industrial area here, you might want to have a residential area on that edge so that they can quickly travel across. It's not necessary, especially if you're good with transportation. If you build a residential area there, you can build a rail line or something and going straight to that area where it's commercial or industrial or whatever. But generally speaking, I would say the takeaway here is to just keep in mind that it's important to think about edges. It's important to think about edges when you build cities. Another thing I can mention along a similar lines is natural barriers to development, right? So there are basically 2 natural barriers to development in SimCity 4. There's water. Water is obviously the most significant natural barrier in the sense that unless we flatten all of this, we can't build on the water. That's one thing to keep in mind. And the other natural barrier is very mountainous regions. Now, we can flatten mountainous regions and we can build, like, we could build like a pretty big city just on here, but we'd have to do a lot of flattening and it would be a little bit awkward to build, and it's also going to be more expensive. So those are the natural barriers you want to keep in mind. Another note on bodies of water, so rivers and lakes and all of that. Bodies of water, on the one hand, they're natural barriers. On the other hand, they can be an advantage. So obviously, like I said, ports are a bit problematic, and you're going to have to use a mod to make ports work properly. Excuse me. But ferries, on the other hand, can be very, very useful, because if we build a ferry here, and let's say we have a commercial area here, ferries are very good at crossing large areas of the map from one very far point to another very directly. So they make a straight line where otherwise here, to get from there to there, you might be going through a complex street grid and stuff like that. So ferries can actually kind of be like, invisible highways in a certain sense that can take Sims from a very far area of the map to a not so far area. Also, Sims will travel from any tile to any neighboring tile. They won't travel from this tile all the way over there. And I discussed that briefly at the end of the transportation at the end of the transportation video. So what that means is that if we have a little residential area, say here, with a ferry, well, technically they'll take the ferry all the way over here because it's still only one tile away. So water is both a barrier and a sort of it sort of facilitates long distance travel at the same time, and that's kind of neat because historically cities are often built along waterways, right? So it's kind of cool. I think and ferries are very important in that sense, because building a bridge from this tile to this tile is impossible. But you can build a ferry link. You could build a bridge across here and then have another bridge going there or something, and that might be a good way to do things. But a ferry will allow you to go straight from this tile to that tile. So, all good things to keep in mind. So, with all of the things I've just mentioned about kind of the macro regional planning thing, and those are things you should think about when you first open up a city region, you can obviously just dive into a tile and start building and let the city grow naturally, and I think that's a good way to do things in a lot of ways. But if you want to kind of plan ahead on a regional scale, then that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about now. And I think that one of the best ways you can plan ahead, actually, because there's no real way to annotate this map in this view, one of the best ways to plan ahead is going to be to either make a little sketch on a piece of paper, and you can draw all of your city tiles and squares, or if you don't want to do that, then maybe you can take a screenshot and annotate it. And I think I'm going to do that just to... we're going to make a plan, and we're going to try and sort of stick to it and see how it works. Okay, so I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna open up that screenshot now, and we're gonna annotate it together on screen. Okay, so I've opened up this screenshot I made in whatever this, I don't know what this is. This is fucking Windows Photos or some terrible photo editor. I don't want to use a very complicated tool as far as I'm concerned. If you want to do this in Paint, in MS Paint, you do it in MS Paint. If you have some really fancy, you know, Adobe Illustrator or something, you do it in that too. The idea here is just to show you could do this on a piece of paper, or you can do it however you want. You also don't have to do this. I'm doing it mostly to demonstrate to some of the principles that I was just talking about. So let's start annotating this map. I'm going to try and use these colored pens here to indicate the different areas that we want to plan out. One thing I didn't mention as well is, remember, I also had said that you don't want to be putting utilities on you know, where you're going to have residential and commercial areas. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is where you're going to place your utilities on the map. And because it's so important to have edges available for some of those important zones, you want to. This is one of the reasons why you want to plan things out. So I don't build a coal factory or a coal plant like right there when I want this to be kind of the downtown hub. So I'm going to go with that idea that I had. By the way, there's a million different ways you could develop this region. This is just one way of doing it, because I've got all these edges here and these neighbors. So let's sort of draw a sort of circle here, and we'll call this a sort of, you know, downtown commercial zone. Okay. And then let's think about where we're going to. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to build a big downtown right away because we're not going to have the demand for it, but we're going to reserve this area for a sort of downtown area. And beside our commercial zone, we're probably going to want some residential areas to feed into it. So maybe we could have a residential zone here. Okay. Maybe we could have another residential zone kind of here. Maybe we could have another residential zone there, and as the residential zones get the more educated they get, the more demand you're going to have for those big commercial offices, right? And it might be interesting to have another residential zone maybe on the other side here. Maybe I'll have kind of a beach area here, so that this commercial area is kind of surrounded on all sides, maybe up here as well, right? It's getting kind of messy. I'm just drawing with a mouse here, so it's getting kind of messy. And maybe even here, we could totally surround this with a residential area, right? And these areas are going to be small enough that we're not going to need some super heavy transportation to actually get there. And let's think about where our industrial zones can be. Let's maybe use this nice gold color for industry. Now we want industrial zones to be near the edge so that they can so that their freight can be sent off the map. This would be an ideal area for a large industrial zone. right? Because we've got these two residential areas there and there that can feed into it, and then once these get better educated, they can start going into the downtown area. And then I think we could also build a zone, maybe we could think about building one here, and we could go outwards. But I'm actually thinking that I'm going to stick with this very, very simple design here, and we'll talk about maybe how to expand afterwards. Because once you've got your two main employment zones going, it becomes relatively easy to expand outwards, I'd say. Like if we build industrial here, maybe we're going to have another less dense kind of suburban area here, and it's going to kind of feed into the industrial, and it's also going to kind of feed in there. Obviously, we can also think about putting we can also think about putting something here, or not there, sorry, something here, maybe some residential areas there that feed into that industrial zone, or maybe some residential areas there, or maybe some employment areas there. One last thing I think we should think about is where we're going to be placing our utilities. And I'm going to try and focus on maybe 3 tiles for the purpose of this demonstration. So maybe these 3, maybe we'll ignore these 2 ones here because they're simple enough. Maybe we'll focus on these 3. So there'll be kind of 2 residential zones, a commercial zone, and an industrial zone, something like that. But we definitely want to think about utilities. And my suggestion, let's use red for utilities. And when I'm talking about utilities, I'm really talking about the dirty utilities, not water. I'm talking about trash and power plants and all that. So we would probably maybe want to put maybe the utilities for this tile. Maybe we'd put them down here. I would suggest when you start cities that we'll talk about neighbor connections and selling power and water between cities after. But for the time being, I would suggest that you give every tile its own independent utilities. It's just going to make things simpler for you. Maybe here. This would be a good spot to build power plants and stuff for this tile because you've got the water as a barrier for all that pollution. For this tile, it could be here. And those are the 3 tiles we're going to work at. These ones you might want to put it maybe in that corner, maybe here. Oops. Maybe here. Okay, you get the sense? So this is kind of a good plan to come up with to begin with, and this plan can evolve as well as you expand. Certainly, there's probably not enough employment here, right? Like, we're probably going to need to maybe put some industry up here, or here, or here, or something, right? And we also might need more commercial. I'll talk more about that as we go along. But this was just a demonstration to give you an idea of how you can plan a region. You can also use this kind of method of annotating a drawing when you're planning your major transportation lines. This is a really, really clumsy annotation tool, whatever this bloody thing that comes bundled with Windows 10 is, but it gives you a sense. So let's dive back into the game, and let's start trying to actually do this. Okay, so here we are back in the Digby region, in the actual game, and I've taken the liberty of naming these 3 cities that we're going to work on for the purpose of this demonstration. So we had decided in our little sketch there that we wanted this to be a primarily sort of a business hub for commercial zones. Call it Jitney Junction. This is going to be a primarily residential city, Pleasant Valley, and this is going to be a primarily industrial hub. So what we're really looking at here, and I think that this is not a bad way to play the game, what we're really looking at here is specialized city areas, right? And specialized city areas are a good idea in some ways, but they do have certain challenges associated with them. So what are we doing? What are we doing when we design specialized, when we plan for specialized cities? We are really what we're doing is we are attempting to reserve demands. So this tile, if we want this tile to be an industrial city, we want to build industry in this tile. we're going to try and not build too much residential or not build too much commercial in this tile, because we want more residential to develop here and we want more commercial to develop there. So really what we're doing is we're reserving demand for neighboring cities in order to try and specialize them. And there's a few ways we can do that. Well, obviously we can simply withhold zoning, right? We can also go to the budget and we can kind of preferentially tax one type of job or population more in one area than the other. And then we can sort of create tax havens, or we can sort of fleece certain industries so that they don't want to build here. So if this is going to be an industrial city, we want to reserve our commercial office population for Jitney Junction there. We could do something like this, where we tax these ones so that they won't build up in this area and they'll build up next door, right? We can do the same thing in a I should put that to 9, not 0. We can do the same thing in our commercial city, where we tax certain kinds of developments and to discourage it from. We could tax dirty industry, for example, or manufacturing industry, so that it doesn't pop up in our commercial area and create all sorts of pollution. We can, to some degree, do the same thing with residents, in the sense that if we want to create a rich city, we could tax low wealth residential. If we want to create a poor city, or we want to make sure that rich people set up in another area, we could tax high wealth residential more. Although that's probably not going to work very well. There's a few problems with doing this, especially in a young city, in the sense that when you're first starting out, you don't have any educated Sims in the region, and you don't have any high quality jobs. So taxing industries, whether it's taxing dirty industry or taxing, whether it's taxing dirty industry or withholding, say, commercial areas from a freshly developing city, you're going to run into a problem where you don't have the foundations of an economy to support that kind of specialization, or to support that kind of tax fleecing. You're going to be preventing jobs that you need in the city from establishing there. You're going to be potentially preventing Sims that you need to make your budgets from settling there. So it's not a good idea to do that right at the start of the game. One of the reasons for this is that remember that every city has its own independent budget. Right? So if this city becomes rich, it's not like that city's going to get to share in the wealth, right? Generally speaking, the commercial city in the long run was going to become the richest city, because the residential city and the industrial city is going to have to deal with heavy utilities costs. The residential city is going to have to deal with heavy services costs, and that's just going to be kind of a fact of life in this game. Residential heavy areas that don't have a lot of employment are probably going to be a little bit less rich than the more purely commercial areas that don't have a lot of residential areas, or that don't have a lot of heavy polluting industry and stuff. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, if we segregate our city tiles too much and we only have industry in this tile, we're going to run into the problem that I discussed in I think the very first episodes, or the episode of desirability, one of the two. We're going to run into the problem where, once again, industry is so expensive, dirty industry is so expensive in terms of utilities, that a city with only industry pretty much can't pay for itself, or you're going to have a great deal of difficulty paying for it. So there's that factor. There's the fact that specialized cities don't function very well. A specialized residential city is going to have a similar problem, where it's going to end up fronting the bill for a lot of the education and health services that the other city tiles are not going to be paying for, and it's going to be very difficult to educate Sims that actually creates the demands for the commercial jobs that you want building up. right, or the high-tech industry, or what have you. There's a few ways that we can do kind of regional budgeting, and we can certainly do, for example, neighbor deals, where one city has a very big dump. Let's say this industrial city has a very big dump, and the other two cities pay this city to dispose their garbage. By all means, play around with neighbor deals. You could have one city that's very clean, that produces the water, and that sells it to the dirty cities. You could have one city that produces a lot of power and sells it to the dirty cities. Neighbor deals are very hard to manage. They're worthwhile to play around with, but especially early on, having one city tile entirely dependent on another city tile, it's going to be a lot of back and forth. It's going to be, okay, so this is my industrial city. I built all the power plants. Well, every time I want to make a power deal, I'm going to have to go back and forth between the two cities, right? And it's a bit of a hassle. It's certainly possible, but it's probably not a very effective way of starting a region and growing a region, especially in the short term or the medium term. So where does that leave us? Basically, the easiest way to start regional play is going to be to start basically in one tile, one tile at a time. I would say you're going to be working in one tile, and part of the issue with that is the time factor and education. So when I was talking about desirability and providing education to your Sims, I mentioned that it takes 5, 10, 15 years to actually get Sims reasonably well educated. So because it takes so long, if I just build a bunch of industry here and then hop over here and build some residential and then hop over here and build some commercial, I'm going to have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between all three regions, and for any level of development to happen. And you can do it, but it's going to be a very tedious way of playing the game. So what I recommend is that you pick one tile, and that you make a mixed usage of that tile, and you can still withhold to some degree certain kinds of development in that tile and reserve them for the other two tiles. So you can reserve the demand for other tiles, but you want to get a city with a functional budget going, and that actually develops a certain critical mass. So which city should we start in then, if we're going to go with this principle that we're going to have one city that's kind of industrial, one city that's going to be mostly residential, and one city that's going to be mostly commercial? Well, probably the first city you should start with is the industrial one, because industry develops the fastest in SimCity 4. Industry develops the fastest partly because it has very few requirements in terms of amenities. So I've jotted down our kind of regional plan here, and I got a sense of where we want to build things here. We decided that we were going to put utilities here, so we can do that. And let's do our zones. So once again, I've run the clock for a year here, and you can see that development pretty much comes to a halt. We need commercial. So if we were playing in a specialized way where we were only building industrial in this tile, only building residential in that tile, and only building commercial in that tile, every time we came to a halt like this, where you can see here, residential is now, we have too much residential. There's not much more demand for industry, and there's not much more, and the only thing that we can develop here is commercial. So if we were going back and forth, then every time we got to a point like this, we would have to jump over to the next city and do that. And you can certainly play around with doing that, but it's going to be very, very tedious, and it's also going to cause some problems in terms of budgeting. So I want this city to be primarily industrial, and I want this city to be primarily commercial. But one of the things I can do is I can do these commercial strips, and I can keep them small if I want. If I want to really reserve, I can just build the bare minimum we need to get the industry going. Because at a certain point, industry will become more. The industry will kind of generate its own demand. So I can certainly build these low-density little strips of commercial to try and make sure that we only, you know, we only build the level of commercial that we actually need for this city without you know, wasting the demand that we would have for commercial offices and stuff like that we want to try and reserve for the downtown area. So I've given them water to allow medium density build up. We've got bus stops. We have our first school. We've put in our first clinic. We can afford a high school. We're providing water to the industry now. Dirty industrial demand is starting to drop. We've got a library and a college. Now, when we have dirty industrial this low, and we have all of this manufacturing industry demand, there's a couple things we can do. First thing we could do is stay in this tile, and we could dezone a bunch of this and rezone it, or we could delete all of this, and it would rebuild as manufacturing, and that's not a bad way to do things. We could also, though, go to the neighboring tile, Pleasant Valley, and we could build a residential area so that those people can come and work here. Both are good options. They're going to have advantages and disadvantages. One advantage of starting with regional play right away is that you're not really going to have problems with demand caps. As soon as we build those neighbor connections, they are going to provide demand cap relief for commercial by making transportation links to neighboring cities for commercial offices, that is, and they're going to provide demand cap relief for industry by giving freight a route off the map. So it's not a bad idea. Now, what's the disadvantage of building residential areas right away in this tile? Well, it's going to probably create more demand for dirty industry, which means that manufacturing industry and eventually high-tech industry is going to have a harder time developing in this tile. And there's no easy answer to this problem. It's also going to be, if we build a bunch of poor residential in this tile to support the dirty industry here, which is no longer in demand, we're going to have trouble paying for the services in this tile to increase the education to make that dirty industry less desirable. There's another thing we can do, though, and that is to take these Sims who are now increasingly demanding manufacturing rather than dirty jobs, and give them a place to work here. So as soon as we arrive in Pleasant Valley, we can see right away that the Pleasant Valley's demand is affected by what we've just done in Smogtown. Okay, so we have no demand for dirty industrial, and we have lots of demand for manufacturing. So this is interesting. As soon as we go to our second city tile, we have demand for a much more healthy kind of industry. So the temptation would be to build residential here. If we build residential here, well, we don't have demand for it, first of all, but even if we did, part of the problem that we would have is that we would create more demand for dirty once again. So, remembering that we have a residential zone here and an industrial zone here, let's build a manufacturing district in Pleasant Valley. So when I build my second city, I provide more services from the start. Normally when we start a city, our first city in the region, we generally don't offer the industry water. We generally don't offer them police. In this case, I've offered them police and fire, and I've given water to the industrial area, because I know that manufacturing industry produces better tax revenues than dirty industry, and requires less utilities. One thing to keep in mind is that if you are building commercial strips to diversify your cities, a great place to put commercial strips is along the edge. because a lot of traffic will move over those routes. You'll notice that I am only providing the strict minimum of transportation links between regions, and that's because I want to concentrate traffic along those routes and take advantage of the customers that are going to give that great boost to commercial areas. Even with manufacturing industry, an industrial city can't pay for itself. However, if we let this residential zone build up, we'll likely end up with dirty industry here, which gives us the same problem that we had in this city. So we link the residential area to the dirty industry there, and now it's somewhat safe to go in here and increase the taxes for dirty industry. I would recommend that you not necessarily go right up to 20% right away, and that you play around with this and let things happen naturally. But it's entirely up to you. If you want to kind of jumpstart things, you can really force your hand and completely ban dirty industry from one tile. Just up to you to play around with it. We can offer these Sims a school right away. Now at this point, we've built up a residential area here. We've offered them a school and a clinic, but our budget's not really allowing us to offer them any more services. So if we really want to avoid having dirty industry build up here, we need more employment to get enough money to offer these Sims more services for sure. So one thing we can do is hop back over to Smogtown and allow the dirty industry to build here. Remember, if you're making a big profit, always offer your Sims more services. After offering the Sims in this city more services, and after allowing the dirty industry to develop to pay for those services, we've now built up a much more substantial population of higher wealth Sims. We still have some poor Sims, of course. We have a fair amount of poor Sims, but we've built up a higher population in this tile of higher wealth Sims. And we've also created, you can see here that we've created a demand for offices. We've also, once again, the demand for dirty has gone down. So an important thing to remember in this process is that every time you start a new residential zone, it's going to take some time before the Sims become educated. So directing your dirty industry or your manufacturing industry into key areas and is going to help you essentially wait for those residential areas to grow. So let's see what happens when we go back once again to Pleasant Valley now that we have more demand for these different types. We're already making over $1,000, well over $1,000 in a budget surplus, which is going to allow us to offer a high school. So now we have yet another city with a very high commercial demand and actually negative industrial demand. So it's finally time to go to our third tile, which is Jitney Junction. So here we are, we've zoned a bit of commercial. These are the two roads that connect to the two cities. So I've purposely created a high traffic area along which perfectly created a high traffic area where we'll get traffic from both cities. And right away, a a fairly substantial shopping district develops. Once again though, I don't want to have a city that's entirely specialized on commercial. So this is not a bad time to be building another residential area here and to start to offer them the same level of services that we're offering in the other cities. Just remember to give time for each city to develop and for education to take effect. So where do we go from here? Well, let's take a look at our regional map once again. Here we are back in the regional view, and what have we got here? So we've got this kind of ugly checkerboard pattern, and please don't think that I'm trying to convince you that this is how you're going to build cities by, you know, building these kind of ugly square zones right on the edge of the tile and everything like that. What I was trying to demonstrate is how the demand from one city transfers over to the other city, and that sometimes when you have a problem that you need to solve in one city, you can go over to the neighbor city and you know, build some stuff and satisfy some of the demands so that it doesn't have to be built here, or vice versa, right? We're also pretty far from that sketch we made, and you know, in some ways I feel like we haven't accomplished what we set out to do with making a sort of commercial area here and all of that, and I've sort of done that on purpose as well, because you know, it's not, you do have to, when you make a plan for a region, you do have to kind of limit your expectations and start working in tiles and play with the neighbor connections. However, if we look at the jobs in each tile, we are actually getting somewhat close to that. So in this city, Smogtown, we have 13,000 industrial jobs. In Pleasantville, we actually have less residential than Smogtown, so obviously it's not going to be, we haven't quite achieved what we hoped in specializing this city in terms of residential. And then in this city we have the most commercial jobs by far, right? So we are incorporating aspects of that, and the regional plan that we made earlier on when I was drawing in that horrible Windows annotation program can certainly be a very useful guiding guide to how you build your city. It can kind of remind you, you know, okay, so our utilities are here, so they're out of the way, and it can kind of remind you what you're trying to accomplish, especially when you're in one of these city tiles and you're unable to view the regional view without going back and forth all the time. It's a useful tool. One thing I would add, and I think this speaks to that point, is that don't get stuck on your plan. If it's not working, or if you need to, you know, do some other kinds of development, like we weren't planning on putting industry in this tile, right? If you need to do some other kinds of developments, you know, do it to make the city functional, and don't hesitate to rezone areas, especially once your city gets bigger and it has a certain critical mass. Early on, doing a lot of heavy rezoning, you can easily go bankrupt. But once your city has a certain amount of critical mass, feel free to replace this industrial zone with commercial or more residential or whatever. As your city grows and as you work on the neighboring regions, the whole economic area is going to have the economic vitality to support that kind of change. So I also pointed out how I sort of demonstrated how you can use taxes. So in this city, I taxed dirty industry and only allowed manufacturing industry to build up, and that's something you can play around with. But it's by no means obligatory. You can let things develop naturally without taxing in one way or another, and you want to be careful about doing that. So let's look at. You know, I don't think a lot of you are going to want to start a city region that looks like this, and that's not the idea. I think a lot of you are going to maybe want to spend a little bit more time on one tile, and I would actually encourage that. I'm going to quickly load up the Plantation Bay region and kind of show you how I did a natural growth based city here. So I started on this tile, which is called Plantation Bay City, and I created this. I'm going to show you the transportation view. I created this kind of, you know, working on creating a sort of downtown area there, and I've got an industrial hub with a port here. You can see 40,000 industrial jobs there, but I've still got some industry in there and 100,000 commercial jobs. And then I'm starting to, the residential areas on the outside are starting to turn into kind of suburban areas that feed into this. So as you're expanding your city, when you're working on one tile, for example, maybe you start to hit the limits of the space in the tile, or maybe you hit some demand caps and you need to go to the neighbor cities. So it's perfectly feasible to stay in one city, make a city that's kind of self-reliant and independent, and then when you hit boundaries, just understand that what I was trying to demonstrate there is to just understand that often you can fix those problems by going to a neighboring city. So I'm just going to pop in here quickly and kind of show you what that looks like, the zones on the main city, and maybe I'll show you very quickly the two of the neighboring cities, so you can get a sense of how that looks when a city starts to get mature. I would say that there's not much more that I can show you in terms of regional play without spending a huge amount of time playing the game, building the city. So and if I thought about maybe trying to make a city that grows bigger and sort of showing you the steps of that, but beyond what I've shown you about how things work near the edges of the city with jobs and Sims moving across to work and to work in other cities and stuff, once you start doing that, there's no recipe, right? There's no recipe as long as you understand the basic dynamics of that, and you can use those as tools to fix particular problems. There's no one way to build a city, and the best way for you guys to get comfortable with it is to just start doing it. Start building a city. If you can get a city this size, 180,000, that's not that. It's not even that big a city, to be honest. In this game, you can easily put 600,000, or you can probably even get 1 million people on this tile if you really wanted to, using the neighbor connections. But let me just click around here and sort of show you how people are getting around. We can see here I've got a subway and elevated rail system. And I've got kind of a hierarchy of transport where people are taking the bus, and there's also there's a regional train network. So if I look at this train station, for example, I've got a lot of people in this suburb who are taking the train across that bridge, and then they're hopping onto the L train here, and then they're going to work maybe in one of these offices, right? Just take one of these office towers. Yeah, so we're getting some people are walking from the neighboring residential areas, and then if you look at these tiles here on the edge of the city, you can see that there's quite a substantial number of people who are commuting in both directions. I guess mostly, it looks like they're mostly going over that way, but and then over here you're going to see the industrial hub of the city is here, so you're going to have a lot of people living in this neighborhood who are actually going to work over here. On that note, let's pop over next door. So this is the inner bay area of the city, and it kind of has a lot of the characteristics of the smog town that I was building. Now keep in mind I am using the functional seaport mod, so I don't really advise that you rely on ports like this. Although you certainly could build an industrial area here, and you could use rail and other means to get the freight off the map. I'm probably gonna post a video, maybe even just about this mod, because it's so great. Functional seaports is an amazing mod. But yeah, let's click around here and just sort of see how it looks. So again, we've got the ground light rail. You can see that a lot of people in this tile are actually working on this tile. Although there we go, we've got some people who are actually taking the train in and going to work in the neighboring city. Looks like we've got passenger rail used here, although for some reason it's actually not appearing on the map, but sometimes things are a bit buggy. And yeah, so that gives you a sense. If we look at the demand here, obviously there's a huge demand for high-tech industry, which I haven't really developed in this region yet. We're also getting demand for offices and stuff like that. And I've been kind of popping back and forth and working on the different parts of this city. You can see as your cities get bigger, it becomes important to have these kind of higher capacity train systems. Certainly if there were only streets and roads in this city tile, we'd start to be having some pretty bad traffic. And also areas of the city might start to be abandoned because if they need to go to the neighboring city to travel, they just can't get there. I'm going to pop over to one more region and then we'll call it for this video. And here we are in Rob's River. Rob's River is kind of a northern suburb of Plantation Bay City, and it started out as a small town, and that small town had a rail station that connected it to the central city, and now the city has grown to the point where it's actually expanded right off of the tile, and these residential areas feed into the businesses down here. Rob's River doesn't have any industry for the time being, although it may very well develop an industrial park of some kind. You also see I've got this kind of exaggerated long elevated rail line, and this is where I'm planning on expanding the city. So it's going to kind of expand until it actually gobbles up this small town that was built when it first started. But anyway, the only reason I'm showing you this region is just to give you guys a sense of where all this can go, you know, of what kind of result you can expect when you spend time in a region and when you spend time developing cities. So yeah, I hope this video on neighbor connections and regional gameplay has been useful, and I hope this whole tutorial has been useful for you. This is going to conclude this 4-episode guide to SimCity that shows you guys the basic concepts of the game. This will be the last episode of that. If you have questions, if you feel like I missed something, if you feel like I did something wrong, please write that down in the comments. I may pin a comment, and I'm thinking about maybe doing a video. If you guys ask questions, if I get enough questions at a certain point, maybe I'll do a video where I kind of select some of the questions I think are the most interesting, and I'll answer those questions in a video. I also want to do a video on mods and my setup for the game, so that if you guys want to have the setup like mine, there are a few mods. Like when you play this game, things may occur a little bit differently. Nothing fundamental, but things may occur a little bit differently in terms of the balance of development and, you know, how many jobs are distributed in various areas of the city and stuff like that. So I'll also be doing a video on that, and probably doing a video on some of my favorite aspects of the network add-on mod as well at some point. But thank you for watching. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Ciao.